Good morning. Welcome to day 12 of the 20-day Building Your Brand Challenge. With all the twos, it's starting to become a bit of a mouthful. I hope you're still with me. I know that yesterday was a huge session, big workout, and that's okay. Some of you are going to keep going on that. You're going to keep going with collating all of your branded content or your potential branded content. And some of you are still ongoing, obviously, with your logo briefs and your content and your video briefs, which is great to see. Today we're going to talk about how your brand walks and how your brand talks. Now, most people think walking, well, what's that got to do with brand? I walk every day. Yep, walk, 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 walk. Yep, yep. So you've got to imagine that if your brand, and this is true of a personal brand, but most people don't make the correlation when it's a business or a product brand, that your brand actually walks and it talks. Now, this is where your brand values exercise, remember the knees, the suspension in your brand anatomy document, is going to come into play. And the reason that I'm talking about this today is after a heavy session about what branded content is and how to use branded content, you need to be mindful of this so you can start discerning what you can use or what you may have to edit or redo in order for it to become usable. So most people know what a brand is. I mean, it's obvious, and most people know how to get one. Where people fall short is not many people know what a brand can actually do. And simply put, I always say that a brand should be able to monetize because the brand sits above the business. It houses and encompasses the business within that. If the brand is strong and it is aligned with the business's vision, then the reality is you'll monetize. And it doesn't matter what you do, and it doesn't matter how you do it. The bottom line is that it will monetize. But most people don't understand how brands walk and talk and what it wears. What it wears is what I mean by what marketing your brand will actually do. And we're going to address that in a few days because that's not relevant right now. But we need to concentrate on walking and talking and give you a better in-depth understanding of what that is. When a brand talks, obviously if we're talking about a personal brand, you're going to be talking about yourself. So when you are actually addressing people and you're talking and you're obviously in business mode, have a think about what kind of language you use, what kind of tone of voice do you use to deliver that message, and what kind of communication style do you actually have. If your brand is a product or a business, you need to make that brand come alive as though it was a person that was actually speaking to you. And again, you need to consider what tone of voice would they speak in? How are they going to deliver that message? And how are you going to receive that message? So one of the ways that I actually explain that to clients is go back to what it is that your brand does and how you communicate that to people, i.e. how you tell people what your brand does or what you do for your brand. And think about that for a minute. If you have a high-end clientele that is actually very refined and they speak the Queen's English, what kind of language or terminology would you use to communicate to them? That's one example of language, tone, and delivery. Another example might be if you have a younger crowd and it's sort of a bit more cash, and you kind of speak in acronyms, and it's like, yeah, whatevs, and WTF and what have you, then that's okay too. That's another example of tone, language, and delivery. And what I mean by that is if you're charging a premium price, but you're like cash, yeah, whatever, you may not have the right type of clientele, or you might not be delivering your brand to the level that your clientele are expecting, and vice versa. Now that's a very extreme example, but you get the picture. And the reason why this is important is because every time you write, every time you speak, every time you read something or you listen to something that you've produced in terms of your branded content, you need to be mindful of this. And the best way to start with this is go back to your brand values, go back to that brand anatomy document and have a look at the kind of words and the language that you've used on that. And that will give you a guide. That in fact should be your go-to document, the be all and end all. Because if you're finding your presentations, if you're rereading articles and blogs that you've written, if you're watching video that you've produced or listening to audio of you speak, and you're not using those words in your brand anatomy document, and you're not using that language, and you're not using that tone of voice, then your branded content is not going to be successful when you market your brand. So what do I do about it? Well, what you do is one or two things. You either go back and adjust the brand anatomy document, or you go back and adjust the branded content. And you're like, oh my God, I can't do that, I haven't got time. Yes, you can. Yes, you can. And it's a simple exercise. Just marry the two up. Sometimes it might be a case of peppering some different language in there. Some case it might be a case of looking up the definition of words and changing the kind of words that you mean. Sometimes it's as simple as using those words but delivering it a different way. So an example might be of, you might use the words of, here, have a cup of coffee, or you might be, would you like a cup of coffee? Or, here, I made something for you. I'm effectively saying the same message, but I'm delivering it differently each time. My tone of voice is different, and I'm slightly adjusting the words that I'm using. That's what you have to do for your branded content. You need to be mindful of how your brand talks. The second part of this exercise is how your brand walks. So what we mean by walking is the visual identity, right? So the substance part, the head part of your brand anatomy document, in terms of how it displays itself. So if you, again, are a living, breathing person, you are your own personal brand, you might have a specific walking style. You know, you might have a bit of a swagger, you might have a dance, you might be a march, you might be walking just normally. Again, the way you walk, the way you present yourself, the way you promote yourself, the way you deliver yourself, the way that you appear, your visual identity translates back to your brand. That's okay if you're a personal brand. If your brand is a business or a product, again, you need to make it come alive. How would it walk? Would it do a fast march? You know, would it be a jog? Would it be a swagger? Again, that's what you've got to consider. Your visual assets, your visual identity. What are you going to be seen as? How are you going to be represented visually is what you've also got to look at. And again, a really good place to start this time is to go to your vision board or your mood board and have a look at that. Have a look at what photographs and images that you've put on there that are inspirational or aspirational to you, and pull those elements out that you can use to compilate or to compose your walk. You know, is it a trademark pair of chandelier earrings for your brand? Is it the color yellow always appearing in all of your branded content? Is it impersonations and voiceovers? You get the idea. Same thing needs to translate for you when you walk. And when I say you, I mean you, your brand, collectively. Because at the end of the day, you've got to feel comfortable with how your brand walks and talks. Because if you don't, when it comes to wearing your brand in terms of the kind of marketing you do, it's going to be very, very uncomfortable. And when I say uncomfortable, the discomfort may be, it's not quite right. You might not get cut through. You might get limited or reduced amount of engagement. You may get some leads, but they may not be quality. In fact, they could very well be tire kickers. So this is why this is an important step to get right, because when it comes to marketing, it'll completely unravel. So just a quick recap, the way that your brand talks is the voice, the language, the tone that it uses. The way that it walks is the visual representation, the visual identity of how you're going to be seen and how you're going to actually be looked at. And of course, remember, don't copycat. Don't do what your competitors are doing. It's okay to take a look and it's okay to pay attention. But the last thing you want is a Frankenstein brand. I've already talked about that. Of course, stay tuned for day 13. Share the love. You know what to do.